Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into something really creepy. Imagine going on a normal school field trip, thinking it's just fun and games, only to end up with a story that keeps you awake at night. These are 10 scary, real-life field trip stories that will shock you. Buckle up, because some of these are seriously disturbing. Now, we've all been on a school trip at some point, right? Whether it's to a museum, a park, or maybe a camping site. Usually, these trips are filled with laughter, silly moments, and a chance to escape the classroom for a day. But sometimes, hidden in the middle of all that fun, strange things happen. Things that don't make sense, things that no one can explain, and things that turn an innocent memory into a nightmare that sticks forever. One of the creepiest parts about these stories is how normal they start out. A group of kids excited to leave school early, teachers doing head counts, everyone piling into a bus with snacks and chatter. It's the kind of scene we all know. But in each of these stories, something shifts. A sound that shouldn't be there. A shadow in the wrong place. A detail in a photo that doesn't add up. That's when the fun trip turns into the kind of memory you wish you could erase. And what makes these stories even scarier is that they not happening in haunted houses or ghost tours where you expect something spooky. They're happening in broad daylight on ordinary school outings, surrounded by people. That's what makes it feel so real. When you think about it, you realize that some of the scariest moments in life aren't when you're alone in the dark, but when you're surrounded by others, yet still something feels off. Like the world has tilted just a little bit. Take a moment and imagine yourself back in your school days. You're sitting on a bus with your friends, sharing snacks, maybe playing some music, excited about the trip. Everything feels lighthearted until you notice one tiny thing that doesn't fit. Maybe it's a face in the crowd you don't recognize. Maybe it's a noise outside that doesn't match where you are. At first, you think you're imagining it. You laugh it off, but then others notice it too. That's when it gets real. The first story I'm going to share still gives me chills. A group of kids went on a forest hike. Everything seemed fine. The teachers were keeping track and the students were walking in pairs. But later, one boy swore he had seen another child walking with them. The problem? No one knew who that kid was. The teachers counted again, and the numbers matched. Still, the boy insisted. Later, when they looked at some of the photos from the trip, there was an extra face peeking out from behind the group. No one ever figured out who it was, and to this day, the kid who saw it says he knows it wasn't his imagination. Another story comes from a museum trip. Students were exploring the art section when a few of them started whispering that they heard soft voices. At first, everyone assumed it was just echoes or maybe other students playing around. But the whispers seemed to come from one of the statues, like it was mumbling under its breath. Some of the kids leaned in, and they swore they heard words, though they couldn't make them out. When they told the tour guide, he didn't even look surprised. He just said, "You're not the first ones to hear that. Imagine hearing that in a quiet museum. You'd probably want to leave right away." And then there's the bus story, which honestly creeps me out the most. After a long trip, the students were heading home, tired but happy. That's when one girl suddenly screamed, saying she saw a man running outside keeping up with the bus at full speed. Everyone laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But when others looked, they saw it too. A figure, just barely visible, sprinting alongside the moving bus. The driver hit the brakes, and when they stopped, the figure was gone. Completely vanished. The driver later admitted this wasn't the first time it had happened on that route. Now, that's the kind of detail that makes you question what's really out there. Not all of these stories happen in daylight. Some are even worse because they happen at night, like the kids who went on a camping trip. Imagine lying in your sleeping bag, surrounded by your friends, when you start to hear footsteps circling your tent. At first, you think it's an animal, but the steps are heavy, too heavy. Teachers check, but they find nothing. Then, just as everyone is trying to calm down, the sound starts again. Closer this time, slower, like whoever, or whatever it is waiting for something. The group barely slept that night, and none of them ever forgot it. One trip to an old battlefield turned out just as eerie. Kids were snapping pictures, having fun, when later, looking through the photos, they saw figures of soldiers standing in the distance. Not reenactors, not costumes, but shadowy figures that didn't belong there. The strangest part was that the kids swore they hadn't seen anyone out there while they were taking the photos. The field had looked completely empty. That kind of story makes you question how thin the line really is between the past and the present. The truth is, field trips are supposed to be educational, maybe even a little boring at times. But these stories prove that sometimes the scariest moments happen when we least expect them. And the more you think about them, the more unsettling they become. Because if something unexplainable can happen in a place as ordinary as a school trip, then maybe it can happen anywhere. So as we go through these stories tonight, keep that thought in the back of your mind. Think about the times you've gone somewhere with friends, how safe and normal it felt. Now imagine if, just for a second, something slipped through. A shadow, a sound, a figure that wasn't supposed to be there. Would you even believe your own eyes? Or would you brush it off until you couldn't ignore it anymore? I'll warn you, some of these stories stick with you. They crawl into your head and make you second-guess the ordinary. That's what makes them so terrifying. Not because they're full of monsters or jump scares, but because they feel so close to reality. And once you've heard them, you can't help but wonder. The next time you're on a trip, will you notice something strange too? So grab your snacks, dim the lights if you dare, and get ready for these 10 scary, real-life field trip stories. Trust me, you're not going to forget them anytime soon. So let's start with the very first story, and honestly, this one has haunted me since the first time I heard it. Imagine you're out on a school field trip, the kind of trip that seems harmless and fun. You're surrounded by your classmates, teachers are walking alongside. The air smells like pine and fresh dirt, and the forest is alive with birds and insects. Everything feels normal, even exciting. The teacher does a head count before heading into the trail, making sure every single kid is present. The numbers match, everyone is accounted for, and the group begins walking deeper into the woods. For a while, the hike goes just as planned. The students are laughing, chatting, pointing at little streams and bugs on the path. Some kids are tired already, dragging their feet, while others are racing ahead, eager to explore. The teachers keep reminding everyone to stay together, to not wander off, because the forest can be confusing, and it's easy to get lost. And in that moment, no one thinks twice about safety. After all, it's just a field trip. What could go wrong? But here's where it gets unsettling. Later, during a short break, one student, let's call him Daniel, pulled his teacher aside. He looked pale, almost nervous to even speak. He told the teacher that while they were walking, he noticed another kid in the group, someone he didn't recognize. Daniel insisted this boy wasn't from their class. He said the boy was trailing just a few steps behind the others, quiet, not talking to anyone, not laughing, just there, watching. The teacher frowned, confused. How could there be another child in the group? They were far from town, deep into the woods, and no one had joined them on the bus. She reassured Daniel it was probably just his imagination. Maybe he mixed up one of the other students in his mind. But Daniel shook his head. He said this boy looked different. His clothes were older, faded, almost like something from another time. He had messy hair, pale skin, and dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in weeks. And the most disturbing detail? Daniel swore the boy was barefoot, even though the forest floor was covered with sharp rocks and twigs. Of course, the teacher brushed it off. Kids have wild imaginations, right? But the thought lingered. Later, when they stopped for lunch, the teacher counted again, just to be safe. Once more, the numbers matched. No one was missing, no one extra. It was impossible. Daniel must have been mistaken. Yet, as the group continued, Daniel couldn't stop glancing behind him, convinced the boy was still there, slipping in and out between the trees. The real shock came later, after the trip. Some of the students had taken photos along the trail, silly group pictures, selfies with friends, shots of the trees and streams. When they shared the pictures afterward, one image stood out. It was a group photo of the students smiling and posing with their teacher. At first glance, everything looked fine, but then someone noticed it. Behind them, between two trees, was a face. A pale face, half hidden, staring directly into the camera. Everyone fell silent when they saw it. The teachers tried to say maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe just another kid in the background. But no one could explain it. Every student was accounted for. The teachers knew exactly how many came and how many left. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else on that trail. And yet, there he was, this strange, pale boy staring out of the photograph. Some of the kids swore the face looked exactly like the boy Daniel had described. Same messy hair, same hollow eyes, same expressionless stare. Daniel nearly cried when he saw it, saying, "That's him. That's the boy I saw." The teachers told everyone to calm down, that it was probably nothing. But the more they zoomed in on the photo, the clearer the face appeared. It wasn't a blur, it wasn't a shadow, it was a person. And yet, no one had seen him except Daniel. The story spread quickly among the kids, and soon no one wanted to talk about it. But rumors started swirling. Some said the forest they had visited was near an old settlement, long abandoned after a tragic fire. Others whispered that the boy might have been a spirit, still wandering the woods, trying to join groups of children who passed through. The weirdest part? In the weeks after the trip, a few of the kids told their parents that they had dreams about the same boy, standing outside their houses, watching them through the window. Now, whether or not you believe in ghosts, you have to admit there's something deeply unsettling about a story like this. A child who doesn't belong appearing in photos, described in detail by someone who swears he saw him. It's the kind of thing you can try to explain away, but at the end of the day, no explanation feels satisfying. It sticks in your mind, crawling into your thoughts when you least expect it. The face in the photo. The extra kid in the woods. Imagine if it had been you on that trip. Would you have noticed him? Would you have brushed it off like the teachers did, or would you have trusted what you saw? It makes you wonder just how often we overlook things. Things that are right there in plain sight, because we don't want to believe they were real. Maybe that's exactly why stories like this get under our skin so easily. Because deep down, we know we might not be able to explain everything. And the creepiest part? To this day, no one knows who that boy was, or why his face showed up in the photos. No one has identified him, and the forest remains just as quiet and ordinary as ever. But those kids, especially Daniel, will never forget what they saw. Every time they look back at that trip, they can't help but remember the extra kid who wasn't supposed to be there. Now, if that story gave you chills, just wait until you hear the next one. Because while this first tale was about an extra child appearing where he didn't belong, the next story takes us somewhere even stranger. It's about a museum visit, where students swore they heard voices whispering from a statue. At first, it sounded like a prank, but what they discovered made them question everything they thought they knew about that place. So, after the unsettling tale of the extra kid in the woods, let's move on to the second story. One that takes place in a place you would never expect something creepy to happen. A museum. Now, most of us think of museums as quiet, safe, and maybe even a little boring. You walk through the halls, look at old paintings, ancient artifacts, maybe some dinosaur bones, and that's it. But for one group of students on a school trip, their visit turned into something they would never forget. The day started off normal enough. The kids were excited to be out of the classroom, happy to roam around and see things they had only read about in books. Their teacher reminded them to behave, not to touch anything, and to stay together. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. They walked through the art gallery, passed by large paintings with eyes that seemed to follow you as you moved, and giggled quietly when they saw statues of people frozen in dramatic poses. But in the middle of all this, something strange began to happen. It started with a whisper. At first, the kids thought it was one of their classmates trying to spook them. But then, more of them started hearing it. The sound was faint, like a low voice just behind their ears, impossible to make out but impossible to ignore. The whispers seemed to be coming from one particular statue, an old stone figure of a man with a serious expression, holding what looked like a scroll. He stood on a pedestal, towering over everyone. The kids swore the whispers came from his direction, almost like he was mumbling to himself. Some of them leaned in, curious. One girl even said she thought she heard her name. That's when things turned from funny to frightening. One student laughed nervously and asked, "Did you hear that too?" And the others nodded. They weren't imagining it. The whispers grew louder, not like shouting, but enough to make them feel surrounded. The strangest part was that no one else in the room seemed to notice. Other groups passed by, teachers walked around, and yet for this group of kids, it felt like the statue was alive. Naturally, the teacher brushed it off, saying it must be the acoustics of the museum. You know how sound can bounce in strange ways inside big halls. But the kids weren't convinced. They insisted the sound was too direct, too clear, and only happened when they stood near that one statue. Finally, one of the students worked up the courage to ask their tour guide about it. They expected the guide to laugh or scold them for making up stories. Instead, the guide paused, his face going a little pale. Then, with a quiet voice, he admitted something none of them expected. "You're not the first to hear that," he said. "People have reported whispers around this statue for years. It usually happens at night when the museum is closed. Security guards have mentioned it too. Some refuse to even walk past it when they're on duty." Imagine hearing that in the middle of a field trip. The kids stood frozen, trying to process what he had just said. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't their imagination. Even adults had experienced it. The guide quickly tried to brush it off, saying maybe it was just the way the building was built, the way sound traveled through the walls. But you could tell from his expression that he wasn't convinced by his own words. He had seen something, or heard something, that he couldn't explain. Later, when the group moved on, some of the kids couldn't stop glancing back at the statue. A few swore they saw its lips moving ever so slightly, as if it really was whispering. Others said they felt cold whenever they got too close, even though the rest of the room was warm. One boy even claimed he saw the statue's eyes flicker, just for a split second, like it was looking right at him. The teacher, of course, didn't believe a word of it. But when the kids left the museum that day, they carried with them a story that would follow them for years. As the days went by, some of them admitted they couldn't stop thinking about the whispers. A few even said they started hearing faint voices at night when they were trying to sleep. Not loud, not clear, but a soft murmuring, just like the statue. Almost like something had followed them home. Of course, that could just be their imagination running wild. But one of the kids swore he dreamed of the statue standing at the foot of his bed, leaning in close and whispering something he couldn't understand. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, and after that, he begged his parents never to let him go back to that museum again. Stories like this make you wonder what's really hidden inside these old buildings. We look at statues and see stone. But what if there's more to it? What if, in some way, the memories or spirits of the people they represent are still attached to them, trapped inside, waiting for someone to notice? It's creepy to even think about. The idea that something so lifeless, something we walk past without a second thought, could be aware of us, could be speaking, even if only in whispers. And the creepiest part? That tour guide wasn't lying. There have been documented cases of museum staff refusing to work near certain exhibits because of strange noises. Security cameras sometimes pick up shadows or movements that can't be explained. So when those kids heard whispers coming from that statue, maybe it wasn't their imagination after all. Maybe they really did hear something, or someone, trying to be heard. Now, if you thought a statue whispering in a quiet museum was disturbing, wait until you hear the next story. Because this one doesn't take place in a building full of art or artifacts. It takes place on a moving school bus where a group of students swore they saw something chasing them down the road. A figure that should never have been able to keep up, and yet somehow it did. And speaking of things that seem impossible, this next story takes us from the quiet halls of a museum to something far more unsettling, because it happened in broad daylight on the way back from a field trip right in the middle of the road. The students had just spent the whole day exploring. They were tired, chatting with their friends, eating leftover snacks from their bags, and looking forward to getting home. The bus was moving steadily along a country road. The sun was beginning to set, painting everything in orange and gold, and the kids were relaxed, maybe even half asleep. That's when it happened. One girl sitting by the window suddenly let out a scream. At first, everyone thought she was joking, trying to scare her friends. But then she pressed herself against the seat, her eyes wide, pointing out the window, yelling that someone was out there. Her classmates leaned over to see what she was talking about, and that's when the bus grew strangely quiet. Running alongside the bus, keeping up with it even as it picked up speed, was the figure of a man. He wasn't dressed like a jogger, and he didn't look like someone out for exercise. His clothes were tattered, old, dirty, almost as if he had been wandering the roads for days. His hair was long and messy, his skin pale, and his expression was blank, completely void of emotion. But the most horrifying part was how effortlessly he kept pace with the bus. No matter how fast the wheels turned, no matter how much the driver pressed down on the pedal, the man's footsteps matched the speed exactly. It was unnatural, like gravity didn't apply to him. Some kids screamed, others ducked away from the window, and a few pressed themselves closer to see if it was really happening. They could see his arms pumping, his legs moving in long strides, but his body never seemed strained. He wasn't sweating, he wasn't panting, he wasn't even blinking. He just stared straight ahead, as if chasing something that only he could see. The bus picked up more speed, yet the man kept running alongside, his head turning just slightly toward the windows, his eyes flickering at the students inside. That was enough to send chills down everyone's spine. The driver noticed the panic and slowed the bus, pulling it over to the side of the road. The kids braced themselves, expecting the man to approach or maybe even climb on. But when the bus stopped, the road was empty. The man had vanished. No footsteps, no shadow running off into the distance, not even the sound of someone retreating through the bushes. Just silence. The students looked at each other in disbelief, some crying, others insisting they had all seen the same thing. The driver looked uneasy, but he didn't seem shocked. That's when he said something that made the entire bus go cold. He admitted this wasn't the first time. He had been driving that route for years, and every once in a while on the way back from trips, someone would report seeing the same figure. Always a man, always running alongside the bus, always keeping up no matter how fast it went. Sometimes only one kid would notice. Other times, the entire bus would see him, and every time, without fail, when the bus stopped, the figure would be gone. Some of the students begged the driver to turn around to take another road, but there was no other way back. They had to keep going, and the rest of the ride was filled with tension. No one wanted to sit by the windows, and every time the trees moved or shadows shifted, the kids flinched, terrified the man would appear again. By the time they reached home, everyone was shaken, and most of them didn't even want to talk about it. But that silence only made the story spread faster, turning into one of those whispered legends that no one dares to say too loud. What makes this story so disturbing is how many times it's been told in different places. There are versions of it from other schools, other towns, where bus drivers and students describe the same thing. A man, or sometimes a shadow, keeping pace with a moving bus appearing out of nowhere and vanishing just as suddenly. Some people believe it's a restless spirit, doomed to run endlessly down the road. Others think it's a kind of omen, a warning sign that something bad is about to happen. And there are always skeptics who claim it as just tired kids letting their imaginations get the best of them. But when so many people tell the same story, you can't help but wonder if there's some truth to it. Imagine how terrifying it must be to look out your window and see a man staring back at you, his feet hitting the pavement but never falling behind, his face expressionless, as if he doesn't even see the cars or the road. And then, in the blink of an eye, he's gone. leaving nothing behind but the sound of your own heartbeat racing in your ears. It's the kind of image that stays with you, the kind that flashes in your mind every time you're on a bus ride at dusk, staring out at the empty road. Some of the kids from that trip swore they never wanted to sit near a bus window again. A few even begged their parents to let them skip the next school outing. They couldn't shake the feeling that the man would return, maybe not on the road, but somewhere else, waiting for them. And the driver, though he kept working, later admitted to another teacher that every time he drove that route, he felt uneasy, like he was being watched. He said the figure always appeared in the same stretch of road, near a patch of trees where an accident had happened years earlier. A man had died there in a collision, running across the street when a car struck him. Some people believe the runner is his spirit, forever replaying his final moments. Whether you believe that explanation or not, it adds another layer of creepiness to the story. Because if that's true, then maybe the man isn't chasing the bus at all. Maybe he's just stuck in time, repeating his last desperate sprint over and over again, trapped between life and death. And the fact that children can see him, while adults often can't, makes it even more unsettling. It's almost as if he chooses who gets to witness him, who has to carry the memory of his endless run. Even now, kids who were on that bus still talk about it in hushed voices. Some say they dream about the man, running through their neighborhoods at night, his footsteps echoing on the pavement. Others refuse to talk about it at all, as if ignoring it might make it go away. But the memory lingers, a silent reminder that sometimes the road home can hold horrors we don't expect. And that leads us into the next story, which might be even more chilling because, unlike a fleeting glimpse of a runner outside your window, this one happened in the middle of the night with students trapped inside their tents on a camping trip, listening to footsteps that never seemed to leave. And just when you think nothing could be scarier than seeing a figure chasing a moving bus, the next story proves that sometimes the worst horrors happen at night when you're forced to stay still and listen. This one comes from a camping trip, the kind of trip that kids usually look forward to all year. Imagine the excitement, packing sleeping bags, roasting marshmallows by the fire, telling silly stories with your friends before finally crawling into a tent. It's supposed to be fun, maybe even magical. But for this group of kids, the night turned into something they would never forget. The day had been full of activity. The students had spent hours hiking through the woods, learning about plants and animals and playing games out in the open field. By the time night came, everyone was exhausted but happy. They sat around the campfire, roasting food and laughing at each other's stories. Teachers tried to keep things calm, but even they enjoyed the relaxed atmosphere, the sound of crickets in the background, the fire crackling under a star-filled sky. Finally, when the fire burned low, the kids were told to head into their tents. The night air was cool, and for most of them, sleep came quickly. But sometime after midnight, things started to change. At first, it was subtle, just the sound of leaves crunching nearby like an animal moving through the forest. No one thought much of it. But then the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Slow, heavy steps circling around the tents. One child woke up, sat up straight, and listened carefully. The sound was steady, almost measured as though someone was pacing. He nudged his friend awake, and soon, whispers spread inside the tent. They weren't the only ones who heard it. The sound seemed to move from one tent to another, circling each one before moving on, as if inspecting them. Some kids froze under their blankets, holding their breath, too scared to move. Others whispered for the teachers. Eventually, a couple of teachers came out with flashlights, shining the beams into the trees and calling out. But when they stepped outside, the sound vanished. No one was there. No animal darted away, no branches moved, nothing, just silence. The teachers tried to calm the kids down, telling them it was probably raccoons or maybe deer. They checked the ground but saw no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest an animal had been near. Once things settled, they told everyone to go back to sleep. For a little while, it seemed like everything was fine again. But just as the kids were drifting off, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, slower. The sound of boots pressing into the soil, circling again and again. Some kids whispered that it sounded like someone dragging their feet. Others thought it sounded like two people walking together, then splitting apart, only to circle back around. The most terrifying part was how close it seemed, sometimes right outside the thin fabric of the tents. One boy swore he saw the shadow of feet through the fabric as someone stopped right in front of his tent before moving on. Once again, the teachers came out, frustrated now, shining their flashlights all around. Still nothing. One teacher even walked a full circle around the camp checking every inch, but the sound always disappeared whenever they searched. As soon as they went back in, though, the footsteps returned, like whoever, or whatever it was waiting for them to let their guard down. It went on like that for hours, a pattern of fear, silence, and then the steady crunch of steps coming back again. By 3 a.m, almost no one had slept. Some kids cried quietly, others held hands with their friends, and a few even begged the teachers to call the buses and go home. The teachers tried to be brave, but even they couldn't deny how strange it was. They couldn't explain the sounds, couldn't prove it was an animal, and couldn't convince themselves it was nothing. They just had to wait out the night, trapped in the middle of the forest with something circling around them, never revealing itself. The strangest part of the story came in the morning. When the sun finally rose and the kids stumbled out of their tents, they expected to see footprints everywhere. But the ground was untouched. No prints, no disturbances, nothing to explain the constant circling they had heard all night. The teachers avoided talking about it, insisting again that it was probably just animals, but the kids knew better. They had heard the steps, heavy and deliberate, far too close to be deer or raccoons. It had sounded human, and that made it worse. Even after they returned home, the story spread quickly. Some kids claimed they had heard whispers along with the footsteps, faint voices that seemed to murmur just outside their tents. Others said they had felt something brush against the fabric, like a hand dragging slowly across it. One girl admitted that she dreamed of someone crouching right outside her tent, waiting, though she couldn't remember the face when she woke. What made the whole experience even creepier was how every kid seemed to remember the sound the same way. Slow, steady, circling, always returning. Some parents later did research on the campsite and discovered it wasn't the first time strange things had been reported there. Other groups had complained about the same noises in the night, some even refusing to camp there again. There were stories of an old caretaker who had once lived on the land decades earlier, a man who had died under mysterious circumstances. Some people believed it was his spirit, still pacing the grounds, checking each tent as if he were inspecting intruders. Of course, skeptics say it was all in the kids' heads, that fear can make ordinary sounds feel terrifying. But the way the story has been retold by so many who were there makes it hard to ignore. These weren't just little noises in the dark. These were clear, heavy footsteps circling again and again, coming closer, pulling away, and returning until morning finally drove them off. And honestly, when you think about it, that might be the scariest part. Because with shadows in a museum or a figure running beside a bus, at least you can tell yourself you imagined it. Or maybe there was some kind of mistake. But when you're trapped in a tent, with nothing but a thin layer of fabric between you and the outside, and you hear footsteps right there, circling, waiting, and no explanation can be found. That's the kind of fear that sticks with you forever. Now, if you thought that was bad, the next story might be even worse, because this one didn't happen in the middle of the night where you could blame shadows or dreams. This one happened in the daylight during a field trip to an old battlefield where students took photos they thought were completely normal, until they looked back later and realized they had captured something that shouldn't have been there at all. And after that night of terror in the tents, when the students couldn't escape the sound of those footsteps circling endlessly in the dark, you'd think nothing could top the fear of something unseen waiting outside. But the next story shows that sometimes even the most open places in broad daylight can hold secrets far darker than any forest at night. This one comes from a history field trip. the kind where students are supposed to learn about the past by visiting the very ground where history was made. Only, in this case, it felt like the past wasn't just history. It was still lingering there, watching. The trip began like any other. A group of students boarded a bus early in the morning, some still half asleep, others chatting excitedly about missing a full day of classes. They were going to visit an old battlefield, a site where soldiers had once fought and died generations ago. The teachers encouraged everyone to take notes, pay attention to the guide, and remember the significance of the place. When they arrived, the field stretched out wide and empty before them, a rolling landscape dotted with old monuments and plaques. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful, considering the violence that had once soaked the ground in blood. The guide began telling stories of the battle that had taken place there, the strategies, the losses, the soldiers who never returned home. The kids listened with half interest, some scribbling down details, others sneaking photos for fun. The teachers encouraged them to capture the scenery, to get a sense of the landscape where history had unfolded. So the kids wandered off in small groups, snapping pictures of the monuments, the grassy fields, and the trees that bordered the land. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. It wasn't until later, when they were back on the bus scrolling through their photos, that things took a disturbing turn. One girl was flipping through her phone when she gasped and showed her screen to her friends. In her photo of the field, behind the group of students posing in front, there were figures, shadowy, faint but unmistakable, standing off in the distance. They looked like men in uniform, lined up as if still preparing for battle. The kids crowded around, some laughing nervously, others shaking their heads, saying it had to be a trick of the light. But the more they zoomed in, the clearer the shapes became. Soldiers, tall, rigid, and utterly out of place. When the teachers saw the photo, they were puzzled. They hadn't seen anyone out there. There had been no reenactment scheduled that day. The guide had specifically mentioned that the field would be empty. No actors, no staff dressed up, nothing. Yet here, plain as day, were figures that shouldn't have been there at all. The teachers told the kids not to panic, that it was probably just a digital glitch, but the students weren't convinced. Especially because more and more of them began to check their photos, and found similar figures appearing. One boy had snapped a shot of the tree line, and between the branches there was a clear silhouette of a man holding a rifle. Another girl had taken a panoramic photo, and you could see a row of shadowy figures stretching across the horizon, blurry but undeniably human. The strangest part was how consistent they looked, like the same group of soldiers appearing in different photos from different angles. None of the kids remembered seeing anyone there in person. The field had been empty, completely empty. As word spread across the bus, the atmosphere changed. The laughter stopped. Some kids deleted their photos, 2 creeped out to keep them. Others stared at the images, zooming in again and again, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. A few whispered about ghosts, saying maybe the spirits of the soldiers had never left the battlefield. The guide overheard and grew quiet, not denying it, just letting the whispers hang in the air. That night, back at home, some of the kids couldn't sleep. They kept replaying the day in their minds, trying to remember if they had felt anything strange while standing in that field. One boy admitted that he had felt cold, even though the sun had been shining bright. Another said she thought she had heard faint shouting in the distance like voices carried by the wind, though she hadn't told anyone at the time. Looking back, it felt like the field hadn't been empty at all. It had just looked that way to the naked eye. The story of those photos spread quickly, and soon people were asking to see them. Some believed it right away, saying the battlefield was known to be haunted. Others laughed it off, claiming it was just pareidolia, the brain's way of seeing patterns where none exist. But the kids who had been there knew what they had seen. They had the photos, and they had the memory of how real it had felt. What makes it even scarier is that battlefields are notorious for these kinds of stories. People talk about hearing drums in the night, footsteps marching across the fields, or voices crying out long after the last soldier had fallen. It's as if the energy of that moment in history is burned into the land, replaying itself again and again for anyone willing, or unlucky enough, to notice. And for those kids, the trip that was supposed to be educational turned into an encounter with the past in a way no textbook could ever prepare them for. Imagine being there yourself, standing on an open field with the wind brushing through the grass, the sun shining down, everything appearing calm. Then, later, realizing you weren't alone, that in every photo, just behind you, were the shadows of men long dead, still standing their ground. It makes you wonder how many other people have stood in that same spot, completely unaware of the eyes watching them from a different time. Even now, some of those students refuse to return to that battlefield. A few won't even look at the photos anymore, too unsettled by what they captured. And maybe it's the most disturbing part, because you can convince yourself you could hear a whisper, or that footsteps in the dark were just animals. But when you have physical evidence staring back at you, when a camera lens shows you what your eyes missed, it's impossible to deny. The shadows were there, and whatever they were, they wanted to be seen. And if that wasn't enough to make your skin crawl, just wait until the next story. Because while the battlefield shadows might have appeared quietly in the background of photographs, the next story is about something that made itself impossible to ignore. It happened during a school trip to an abandoned hospital where a locked door started knocking from the other side, even though no one was supposed to be there. And if the battlefield shadows left you unsettled, knowing that the past can leave imprints that still linger in the present, the next story will make you even more uneasy. Because while the battlefield was open and wide, with figures appearing faintly in the distance, this one happened in a place far more confined, far more claustrophobic. It was during a school trip to an old, abandoned hospital. Now you can imagine how creepy that must have already felt. A hospital left to rot, the walls peeling, the windows cracked, the smell of dust and decay in the air. Places like that already carry an energy that makes your skin crawl, even before anything unexplainable happens. The students were led through the building in groups, guided by their teachers and a security guard who had the keys. They were told to stay together, to not wander off, because some parts of the building weren't stable anymore. The floors creaked, the air was thick, and even though it was daytime, the light struggled to filter through the grimy windows, leaving long shadows in every corner. The kids whispered nervously to each other, joking at first about ghosts, but their laughter never lasted long. The deeper they went into the hospital, the heavier the atmosphere became. Then they reached a hallway where one door stood out. It was heavy, metal, and tightly locked with a chain. The guide said it hadn't been opened in years, that there was no reason to go inside since the room was just filled with debris. The group nodded and prepared to move on. But that's when it happened. From the other side of the locked door came a sound. A knock. Clear, deliberate, and loud enough to make everyone stop in their tracks. At first, no one moved. The students exchanged nervous glances, waiting for someone to explain it. Maybe it was the pipes, maybe the building shifting. But then it came again. Another knock, this time louder, sharper, as if someone on the other side was demanding to be let out. A few kids screamed, some grabbed onto their friends, and the teacher tried to calm everyone down, though her own voice was shaking. She told them it was probably just the building settling, but no one believed that. The sound was too precise, too human. The knocking didn't stop. It came in bursts, sometimes soft, sometimes hard, like fists pounding on the metal. The teacher, looking pale now, finally called over the security guard and demanded the door be opened, just to prove it was empty. The guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He muttered that the room hadn't been touched in decades, that no one could possibly be inside. But with all the kids watching, whispering, crying, there was no choice. He unlocked the chain, pulled back the bolt, and swung the heavy door open. The group held their breath as the door creaked on its rusty hinges. The light from their flashlights swept across the room, and what they saw made the air feel even colder. The room was empty. Completely empty. Dust covered everything, so thick it puffed up into clouds when they stepped inside. Old equipment lay broken in the corners, rusting and forgotten. But there were no footprints. No sign of anyone moving through the dust in years. The floor was untouched except for the fresh marks their own shoes were now making. And yet, just minutes before, they had all heard the knocking. Loud. Urgent. From inside that very room. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The teacher forced a smile and told everyone to move along, but her face betrayed her unease. The students didn't argue. They hurried out of the hallway, desperate to put as much distance as they could between themselves and that locked door. But the story didn't end there. Later, when the trip was over and the kids were talking among themselves, a few of them admitted they had heard something else, not just knocking. Some swore they had heard faint voices from behind the door, like whispers overlapping, too low to understand but too real to ignore. One girl even claimed she heard her own name being called softly, right before the teacher had ordered the door open. She hadn't told anyone at the time, too afraid they would laugh, but when she heard others saying the same thing, she realized she wasn't alone. The security guard, when pressed, eventually admitted that this wasn't the first time strange things had happened near that door. Other visitors had reported the same knocking. Sometimes staff heard it at night, when no one else was in the building. A few even refused to patrol that hallway anymore, choosing instead to take the long way around just to avoid it. No one knew why the room was locked in the first place, or what had once been kept there. The records were old, incomplete, and the hospital had been shut down decades earlier. Some said it had been a storage room. Others whispered it was used for patients no one wanted to remember. Whatever the truth was, the experience left a mark on the students. They had walked into that building thinking it was just another boring history trip, a chance to explore something old and forgotten. But they left with the memory of a door that knocked from the inside, a sound that no one could explain, and an emptiness that made no sense. Even years later, some of them say they can still hear the sound in their minds, the hollow thud of fists against metal echoing in an abandoned hallway. It's the kind of story that makes you realize how fragile the line is between what we can explain and what we can ati. We want to believe that old buildings are just creaky, that sounds come from pipes or wind, that there's always a logical reason. But when you stand there, staring into an untouched room full of dust with no footprints, no signs of life, and you know for a fact you heard something, or someone, trying to get out, it leaves you questioning everything. And maybe that's why this story continues to spread, passed down from those who were there to anyone willing to listen. Because it wasn't just one kid hearing things, or one teacher trying to make a lesson spooky. It was dozens of people, all hearing the same knocking, all staring into the same empty room, all left with the same unsettling question. If no one was in there, then who was knocking? Now, as creepy as that sounds, the next story might be even stranger because while a locked door in an abandoned hospital feels like the perfect setting for something supernatural, the next one happened in a place that should have been safe, even cozy. It took place in a mountain cabin during a school trip, where a student looked into a mirror and saw not her own reflection, but another face smiling back. And after that eerie moment in the abandoned hospital with the locked door knocking from the inside, you might think things couldn't get worse. But the next story takes us somewhere different, up into the mountains where a group of kids spent the night in a wooden cabin. At first glance, it seemed like a cozy trip, the kind of getaway that makes you forget about the world. The cabin smelled of pine. The air outside was crisp and the kids were excited to stay somewhere that felt like an adventure. They spent the day hiking, exploring trails, and playing games in the open field, then later sat together enjoying hot drinks while the teachers tried to keep them calm. It felt safe, almost like summer camp. But sometimes the places that feel safest can hold the darkest surprises. That night, after everyone had been sent to bed, the cabin grew quiet. The sound of laughter and chatter faded into whispers, and eventually into the silence of sleep. The wooden walls creaked now and then with the shifting of the structure, and the wind whistled faintly through the trees outside. For most of the kids, sleep came easily after such a long day. But one girl, restless, got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. She padded across the cabin quietly so as not to wake anyone, the floorboards groaning softly beneath her steps. The bathroom was small, lit only by a dim bulb that flickered once when she turned it on. She washed her hands, splashed some water on her face, and then looked up into the mirror. At first, everything seemed normal, her own tired reflection staring back at her. But then she blinked. Her reflection didn't. Instead, the face in the mirror began to change. The features softened, shifted, and suddenly it wasn't her looking back anymore. It was another girl with pale skin and dark eyes, smiling wide. The girl froze, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She leaned closer, hoping maybe the flickering light was playing tricks on her. But the face in the mirror leaned closer too, only it wasn't copying her movements. It tilted its head slowly, the smile growing wider, revealing teeth that didn't look quite right. The girl stumbled back, heart pounding, but the face in the mirror didn't disappear. It stayed there, staring, smiling, as if amused by her fear. Terrified, she bolted out of the bathroom and ran straight back to her bed, pulling the blanket over her head. She didn't tell anyone at first, convinced they would laugh or accuse her of dreaming. Somehow, she managed to fall asleep, though it was restless, filled with unsettling dreams of shadows moving just beyond her vision. But the nightmare wasn't over. The next morning, when everyone woke up and gathered to get ready for the day, a teacher went into the bathroom and noticed something strange. The mirror, which had been perfectly fine the day before, now had a long crack running across it, splitting the glass diagonally like something had pressed hard from the inside. The teachers assumed someone had bumped into it. Maybe one of the kids had been careless. But when they asked, no one admitted to touching it. And the girl who had seen the face in the mirror stayed quiet, her stomach twisting as she stared at that crack. She knew what had caused it, or rather, who. For the rest of the trip, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every reflective surface, windows, shiny floors, even the screen of her phone, made her nervous. She kept catching glimpses of movement where there shouldn't be any, shadows flitting across the glass too quickly to identify. It was like the thing in the mirror hadn't been trapped there after all. It had found her, and now it followed her wherever she went. When she finally confessed to her closest friend about what she had seen, the other girl went pale. She admitted that she too had noticed something strange in the cabin's mirror that morning while brushing her teeth. She said she felt as though the mirror was pulling at her reflection, as if the glass wanted her to step inside. She hadn't said anything because she thought it was just her imagination, but after hearing the story of the smiling face, she knew it wasn't. That night, back home, the girl who first saw the face had another experience. She woke up around 3 in the morning and felt compelled to look at the mirror in her bedroom. Her heart sank when she noticed the faint outline of a crack, just like the one in the cabin's mirror, even though her own mirror had been perfectly fine the day before. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and when she looked again, the crack was gone. But she swore she saw movement, a shadow slipping back into the glass. The more she tried to ignore it, the worse it got. For weeks after, she would see faint impressions of that same smiling face whenever she looked into a mirror for too long. Sometimes it was just a flicker, gone before she could focus. Other times it lingered longer, smiling, waiting, reminding her of that night in the cabin. She stopped using mirrors as much as she could, brushing her teeth in the dark, avoiding eye contact with her reflection. But deep down, she knew the face was still there, waiting for the moment she let her guard down. Years later, when she told the story again, she said the scariest part wasn't the crack or even the smile. It was the feeling that the face in the mirror wasn't random. It wanted her. It had chosen her. And once something chooses you, it doesn't just vanish when the trip ends. It stays with you, following you, waiting in every reflection you see. Stories like that make you wonder what mirrors really are. We think of them as simple glass, just showing us what we look like. But what if they're more than that? What if they're doors, or thin barriers to something else? And what if sometimes, when we stare too long, something on the other side stares back? And just when you think that's terrifying enough, the next story will take that same sense of being watched and make it even creepier. Because while the mirror showed something that didn't belong, the next trip brought students face to face with something that moved entirely on its own. A swing set in an empty park swaying back and forth as if someone invisible was still sitting there waiting to play. And after the terrifying encounter with the face in the cabin's mirror, you'd think that the students could finally relax once they left the mountains behind. But the truth is, strange things don't always stay confined to dark cabins or broken glass. Sometimes they happen in the most ordinary, innocent places, the kind of places that should feel safe, like a park. This next story happened during a school trip to the countryside, in a wide-open park surrounded by trees and fields. The kids were relieved to be out in the open after hours of sitting on a bus. They scattered around, running to the picnic tables, climbing the jungle gym, and rushing over to the old playground with swings and slides that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. It felt light-hearted, almost like a reward for the long ride, until something happened that no one could explain. The swings were the first thing that caught the students' attention. There were 3 of them, lined up neatly, the chains rusted from years of weather, the seats wooden and worn smooth from countless children before them. The kids laughed and rushed over, eager to claim a spot, but as they approached, they froze. One of the swings was already moving, not just a little, but back and forth in a steady rhythm, as if someone invisible was sitting there, pumping their legs to gain momentum. The problem was, there was no one near it. Not a single child had touched it, and the air was still. The trees weren't moving, the grass didn't sway. There wasn't even the faintest breeze. Yet the swing creaked back and forth, faster and faster, as though occupied. At first, some of the kids laughed nervously, waiting for someone to admit it was a prank. Maybe someone had run by and pushed it when nobody noticed. But the teachers had been standing nearby the entire time, and they shook their heads, confused. One teacher, trying to lighten the mood, smiled weakly and joked, "Maybe someone invisible wants to play." But the words fell flat. Not a single child laughed. They all just stared, wide-eyed, as the swing continued to move. What made it worse was that it didn't slow down. Normally, when a swing is pushed, the motion fades gradually until it stops. But this one didn't stop. It kept swinging back and forth in that same rhythm, as if whatever force was moving it wasn't ready to let go. Some of the kids backed away, clutching at their friends' arms. A few whispered that they could see faint impressions on the wooden seat, like the weight of someone sitting there, though no one could agree if it was really there or just their imagination. The teachers tried to convince the kids it was nothing, maybe a strange current of air, but their voices betrayed a nervous edge. One of the braver boys walked up to the swing and tried to grab it, hoping to prove everyone wrong. But as soon as his hands touched the chains, the swing jolted, twisting sideways out of his grip, as though yanked away by unseen hands. He stumbled back, pale and speechless, while the swing slowly returned to its steady back-and-forth motion. That was enough to silence even the boldest kids. For the rest of the visit, the swing remained in motion. No matter how much time passed, no matter how far the kids walked away and then returned, it never slowed, never stopped. It was as if the park itself was playing host to someone, or something, that refused to let go of its favorite toy. Some of the children swore they heard faint giggles, the sound of a child's laughter carried through the air, but so soft it was hard to tell if it was real. Every time someone turned to pinpoint the sound, it vanished, replaced by the squeak of rusty chains moving back and forth. When it was finally time to leave, the teachers herded the group back toward the bus. None of the kids wanted to walk past the swings again, but they had no choice. As they filed by, each one turned their head, unable to resist one last look. And sure enough, the swing was still moving, steady and strong, like someone was still sitting there refusing to say goodbye. One of the teachers, who had been silent the whole time, muttered under his breath that it wasn't the first time he'd seen something like that at this park. He didn't explain further, and the kids were too scared to ask. Back on the bus, the atmosphere was tense. No one wanted to talk about what they'd seen. A few kids deleted the photos they had taken, claiming the swing looked strange in them, almost blurry as though the camera couldn't quite capture it. Others simply stared out the window, trying to pretend it hadn't happened at all. But the truth was, none of them could forget the sight of that swing moving on its own, untouched, unshaken by wind, stubbornly alive with an energy that didn't belong. Later, when some of the kids told the story to their families, they were met with nervous chuckles or skeptical frowns. Parents said it must have been the wind, even though the kids insisted the air had been perfectly still. Others said maybe the swing chains were loose or rust made them shift strangely. But the children knew what they had seen, and the fear in their voices when they described it made it clear it wasn't just a trick of the eye. What's even creepier is that people who live near the area have told similar stories. Locals claim that the park has long been haunted, that late at night if you drive past, you can see the swings moving on their own, even when the air is dead calm. Some even say they've seen a child sitting there swinging back and forth, but when they look again, the seat is empty. And once you've heard that, the story of the school trip doesn't feel like a one-time coincidence. It feels like they stumbled onto something that's been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. And maybe that's the scariest part, because playgrounds are supposed to be places of laughter and innocence, filled with joy. But in this case, the laughter was gone, replaced by fear, and the swing wasn't just a toy. It was a reminder that some presences don't move on, even in the brightest, most ordinary places. They linger, playing their games in silence, invisible but not gone. And if that doesn't already make you uneasy, the next story might. Because while a swing moving on its own is terrifying enough, the following trip led students into a cave where they heard something far worse. Haunting chants echoing through the darkness, voices rising where no one was supposed to be. And after the unsettling image of the swing moving on its own in that empty countryside park, as though someone invisible was still sitting there, you'd hope the students would finally get a break from strange encounters. But sometimes, the scariest experiences don't happen in the open where you can see the sky, but deep underground, where the darkness presses in on all sides. The next story comes from a field trip that was supposed to be educational, a geology outing where students explored a large cave system with their teachers and a local guide. At first, everything seemed like an exciting adventure. The kids carried flashlights, helmets with little lamps attached, and they laughed at how their voices echoed inside the entrance as they stepped into the cool, damp air of the cave. The guide explained the history of the place, how the cave had formed over thousands of years, the minerals that lined the walls, and the strange shapes the rocks had taken over time. The kids snapped photos of stalactites hanging from the ceiling and stalagmites rising from the ground, fascinated by how alien it all looked. The deeper they went, the cooler the air became, and the light from the outside world slowly disappeared behind them. At first, the atmosphere was fun, filled with curiosity, but the further they went in, the heavier the silence became, broken only by the drip of water and the shuffle of feet. It was during this silence that it began. At first, the sound was faint, so low that most of the kids thought they were imagining it. A soft hum, like distant voices carried through the rock. Then, slowly, it grew clearer, resolving into a pattern. It wasn't random noise, it was chanting. A low, rhythmic sound, many voices overlapping, rising and falling in unison. The students froze, glancing nervously at each other, their laughter gone. Some turned to their teachers, their flashlights trembling as the sound echoed through the cavern. The teachers tried to stay calm, though their eyes betrayed unease. They motioned for the guide, whispering, asking if another group was supposed to be in the cave. The guide shook his head firmly. There were no other groups scheduled that day. The cave was closed to everyone else, yet the chanting continued, steady and deliberate, reverberating off the stone walls as if coming from deep within the earth. The sound was strange, haunting, almost ceremonial. Some of the kids whispered that it didn't even sound like words they understood, more like an ancient language or a song from another time. Others swore they heard specific words, though none of them could agree on what had been said. What they all agreed on, however, was that it felt wrong. The rhythm was too perfect, too coordinated, like a group of people performing a ritual in the dark. One of the students, curious despite his fear, pointed his flashlight toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the cave. The moment the beam hit the darkness, the chanting stopped. Dead silence. Everyone held their breath, straining to listen. For a few seconds, the cave was so quiet they could hear the drip of water and the sound of their own hearts pounding. Then, slowly, the chanting began again, but this time it was louder, closer, as if whoever, or whatever, was making the sound knew they had been discovered. That was enough for the teachers. They quickly ordered everyone to turn around and head back toward the entrance. The kids didn't argue. They clutched each other's arms, walking as quickly as they could without running, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Behind them, the chanting continued, growing fainter as they moved away, but never disappearing completely. It followed them, lingering until the first faint glow of daylight from the cave's entrance appeared ahead. Only then, as they stepped back into the open air, did the sound finally fade into silence. Outside, the kids bombarded the guide with questions. Who else could have been in there? Was it a prank? Some kind of recording hidden in the rocks? But the guide's face was pale and he shook his head. There had been no other group scheduled. He insisted the cave had been empty except for them. The teachers tried to reassure the kids that maybe the sound had traveled from outside, that caves were tricky with echoes, but even they didn't sound convinced. Everyone had heard it too clearly, too deliberately, for it to be just an echo. Over the next few days, the students couldn't stop talking about what they had heard. Some claimed the chanting had felt almost hypnotic, like it was pulling them in, urging them to step deeper into the cave. Others said they felt watched the entire time, as if unseen eyes were following them in the darkness. A few admitted that when they closed their eyes at night, they could still hear the rhythm of the voices echoing faintly in their minds. Stories about the cave spread quickly. Locals whispered that strange things had always happened there, that people sometimes heard voices when the cave was supposed to be empty. Some said it was the spirits of those who had once taken shelter there, chanting forever in the darkness. Others believed it was something far older, something tied to the land itself, a presence that lived in the shadows of the cave and resented anyone who disturbed it. Whatever it was, the sound was never explained, and the students who heard it will never forget the way it made them feel. It's unsettling to think about, isn't it? Being deep underground, knowing that there's no easy way out, and suddenly realizing you're not alone. Not because you see someone, but because you hear them, their voices rising together in a rhythm that doesn't belong to you. It's the kind of fear that gets under your skin, because there's no rational explanation you can cling to. No wind, no animals, just a sound that shouldn't exist, yet does. And if that makes your skin crawl, the final story in this collection will take it one step further. Because while the chanting in the cave suggested a hidden presence that was never seen, the last story is about something even more terrifying. A teacher who vanished in front of his students during a trip, only to return minutes later with no memory of where he had been leaving. Everyone wondering if he had truly disappeared or if something else had taken his place. And after the unsettling experience in the cave, with voices chanting in the darkness where no one was supposed to be, you'd think nothing else could shake a group of students more than that. But the last story might be the most disturbing of them all, because this time, it wasn't just a shadow in a photo, a sound in the night, or a figure glimpsed through glass. This time, it was someone they knew and trusted, their own teacher, who seemed to vanish into thin air right before their eyes. It happened during a routine field trip, nothing unusual or spooky about the location itself. The group had spent the day walking through a nature reserve, following trails, taking notes on the plants and animals, and listening to their teacher explain the history of the land. The atmosphere was calm, almost relaxing, with sunlight streaming through the trees and the sound of birdsong filling the air. Everyone felt safe, surrounded by classmates, teachers, and the steady crunch of footsteps on the path. The The teacher leading the group was walking near the front, checking occasionally to make sure the kids were keeping up. He was chatting casually with a few students, pointing out details about the environment, when suddenly he wasn't there anymore. One moment he was in front of them, his voice clear and steady, and the next he was gone. No warning, no sound of movement, no sign of where he had gone. Just gone. The students stopped in their tracks, staring at the empty space where their teacher had been only seconds earlier. At first, they thought he had simply stepped off the path, maybe to check something in the bushes or look at a marker. But when they called out his name, there was no response. The forest was still, the trail empty. The other teachers hurried forward, checking both sides of the path, shouting louder, but still nothing. For a few tense minutes, panic spread through the group. The students clustered together, whispering frantically, some starting to cry. How could a grown man just vanish in the middle of a wide trail with dozens of witnesses? And then, just as suddenly as he had disappeared, the teacher reappeared. He walked back onto the trail from between the trees, his face pale, his clothes rumpled, and his expression distant, as though he had just woken from a dream. The students gasped in relief, rushing to him, demanding to know where he had been, but his answer only made things worse. He said he didn't know. He claimed he couldn't remember leaving the trail at all. In fact, he said the last thing he recalled was walking with them as normal, and then everything went blank until he found himself standing among the trees, unsure of how he had gotten there. The teachers tried to laugh it off, suggesting maybe he had fainted or gotten turned around, but no one was convinced. The kids swore they had been watching him closely, and he hadn't wandered off. One moment he had been right in front of them, and the next he was gone. There was no rustling of leaves, no crunch of footsteps, no sign of him leaving. It was like the world had blinked, and he had been erased from it only to return minutes later. The more unsettling detail came when a few of the kids whispered about what they had seen in those missing minutes. One girl swore she had noticed a strange flicker in the air where the teacher had been, like heat rising off pavement, distorting the space. Another claimed she had heard a soft humming sound, low and mechanical, just for a second before he vanished. And another insisted she had seen him step forward as though into thin air, his body dissolving like mist until nothing was left. When asked about it later, the teacher admitted he felt strange even after returning. He said his body felt heavy, his head dizzy, as though he had been somewhere else entirely, though he couldn't remember where. He kept repeating that it had only felt like a second to him, though the students said he had been missing for nearly 5 minutes. That gap in time, that confusion, made the whole incident even more unsettling. Some of the parents who heard the story later speculated about medical explanations. Maybe it had been a blackout, a seizure, or some kind of stress-induced fainting spell. But that didn't explain why the teacher's body had completely vanished from sight. Why dozens of students swore he hadn't collapsed or wandered off, but simply ceased to exist for those few minutes. And it certainly didn't explain why, when he returned, he seemed so disoriented, unable to recall anything at all. For the students, it was an experience that stuck with them forever. One moment, their world felt safe and ordinary, led by a figure of authority they trusted. The next, that safety was ripped away, and they were left staring into the impossible. It wasn't just a ghost story or a creepy sound in the dark this time. It was reality breaking for a few terrifying minutes. And once something like that happens, once you watch a person vanish and then reappear with no explanation, the world never feels quite the same again. Over time, the story spread among the students like wildfire. Some insisted it was proof of something supernatural, maybe a slip between dimensions, a moment where their teacher had stepped into another place and then been thrown back. Others whispered about abduction, though they couldn't agree on by what, spirits, aliens, or something else entirely. The teacher himself never spoke of it again. He returned to his work, taught his classes, and carried on as though nothing had happened. But the students never forgot the look on his face when he stumbled back onto the trail. Pale, shaken, and lost. And that's what makes this final story so disturbing. It reminds us that sometimes, The unknown doesn't lurk in the shadows or hide in abandoned places. Sometimes it slips into the middle of the ordinary, pulling someone away and then dropping them back, leaving everyone to wonder what really happened in those missing minutes. So, when you think back to all these stories, from the extra child in the woods to the whispers from the statue to the runner by the bus, the footsteps around the tents, the shadows on the battlefield, the knocking door in the hospital, the face in the mirror, the lonely swing, the chanting cave, and finally the vanishing teacher. They all share something in common. They take ordinary moments, ordinary trips, and twist them into something unforgettable. Because that is the nature of fear. It doesn't always wait in the dark corners of haunted houses. Sometimes it finds us on sunny school trips, on buses, in parks, in classrooms, and in the people we trust the most. And maybe that's why these stories linger long after the trips end. They remind us that the world is stranger than we want to believe, and that even when we're surrounded by friends, teachers, and the comfort of routine, we're never entirely safe from the unknown. And that brings us to the end of these 10 stories, and I think by now you probably feel the same thing I do, that not every trip, not every journey, is as simple or harmless as we expect. When we hear the words school trip, most of us think of excitement, of fun, of learning outside the classroom, of laughing with friends, maybe eating snacks on the bus and taking silly pictures along the way. We don't usually think of fear or the possibility of something unexplainable creeping in when we least expect it. Yet these stories prove otherwise. They remind us that even the most ordinary trips can hold moments that stay burned into memory. Moments that keep you awake at night wondering if what you saw or heard was real. Think about the extra kid in the woods. How unsettling it was to realize that a face appeared in photos that no one remembered seeing. A child that didn't belong, staring back as though he had always been there, as though he wanted to be remembered. Or the statue in the museum, whispering words that children swore they could hear, confirmed by a guide who had heard them too, long after the building was closed. How do you explain something like that? How do you walk past statues the same way again, when you know they might not be as lifeless as they seem? And then there was the man running alongside the bus, keeping pace with a vehicle no human should be able to match. The image of his blank face and effortless strides is the kind of thing that sears itself into memory, the kind of detail you cannot shake off no matter how many times you tell yourself it couldn't be real. Then the tents in the woods where the footsteps circled endlessly all night, never seen, but always heard a reminder that sometimes the unknown doesn't reveal itself. It just waits outside the thin fabric that separates you from the night. The battlefield photos, with soldiers appearing where no reenactors were scheduled to be, left a permanent scar on those kids who saw their images haunted by shadows of men who had died long before. And the hospital, with that locked door knocking from the inside even though the room was thick with undisturbed dust, left everyone wondering what or who was trying to be heard. Each story builds on the last, adding layers of unease, each one whispering the same truth. We don't always know what's around us, even when we think we're safe. The mirror in the cabin was perhaps one of the most personal fears, because it is not just about seeing something strange on a trip, it's about taking it home with you. That smiling face staring back, leaving a crack in the glass as though it wanted to escape, isn't the kind of thing you leave behind when you pack up and head home. It follows you into every reflection afterward, into every glance at yourself. And the lonely swing in the countryside park only added to that dread because it was such an ordinary place, such a normal object, yet it behaved in a way no one could explain. A swing moving back and forth without wind, without hands to push it, as though a child long gone still wanted to play. The chanting in the cave might be the one that makes your skin crawl the most, because sound has a way of cutting deeper than sight. Seeing a shadow, you can convince yourself it was a trick of the light, but hearing voices, coordinated, rhythmic, in a place that should be empty, there's no way to write that off as an accident. And the vanishing teacher, the man who disappeared in front of his students and returned minutes later with no memory of where he had been, feels like the final twist of the knife. Because it wasn't just something at the edge of vision or a sound in the dark, but a person, someone alive and trusted, torn away and then returned without explanation. And once you witness something like that, the world never feels as stable again. Each of these stories shows us something different, but together they paint the same picture, that the unknown doesn't live only in haunted houses or ghost towns, but in the ordinary places we pass through every day. A forest trail, a school bus, a museum, a park, a cave. These are places meant to be safe, meant to hold nothing more than learning and laughter. And yet, time and again, people come back from them carrying memories they can't explain, experiences they wish they could forget but never can. So when we ask ourselves why these stories stick with us, maybe the answer is simple. They linger because deep down we recognize that they could have happened to us. We've all been on trips like these. We've all sat in buses, walked through fields, stared into mirrors, listened to silence in the dark. And if these things happened to those students, who's to say they couldn't happen again? To anyone. To you, or to me. And maybe that's why you're still here, listening. Because a part of you knows that these stories aren't just entertainment. They're warnings, echoes from other people's lives that remind us the world isn't as ordinary as it seems. That behind the comfort of routine, there are cracks where something else slips through. Something strange. Something uninvited. Something terrifying. So now I want to ask you, which of these stories unsettled you the most? Was it the boy who appeared in the photo, the mirror face that smiled when it shouldn't have, the chanting voices in the cave, or the teacher who vanished? Maybe it was all of them, each one leaving a piece of dread behind. Let me know in the comments which one stuck with you, which one you'll be thinking about when you turn off the lights tonight. And if you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through all 10 of these chilling tales. If you enjoyed them and want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I post new stories every week, and you never know what might be coming next. It might be something from history, something from everyday life, or maybe even something closer to home than you'd like to believe. Remember, the world is full of mysteries, and sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones we see in movies or read in books. They're the ones that happen quietly, in places we thought we understood, when we least expect them. And if there's one lesson to take from all of these stories, it's this: always pay attention. Listen to the footsteps, watch the shadows, and never ignore the feeling that something isn't quite right. Because sometimes those feelings are warnings, and sometimes those warnings are all you get. So, until next time, stay safe, keep your eyes open, and don't let your guard down, even on something as ordinary as a school trip. Because if these stories have taught us anything, it's that the unknown doesn't need an invitation. It just shows up, waits quietly, and makes sure you never forget it was there.